Hey, George, how are you doing today?
I'm doing all right.
So with the coronavirus thing, I'm doing all these interviews virtually now. So, can you tell me a little bit about yourself, George?
I'm a computer science student at Carnegie Mellon University. I am currently at Carnegie Mellon University right now, and I'm a sophomore.
Oh, okay. So you'll be staying on campus, or?
For the foreseeable future, I'm planning on it.
Oh, good deal. So I guess first off, did you know that NASA is planning to send people to the moon in 2024?
I was familiar with it, though I don't know very many of the details about it.
Um, well, I mean, one of the things is the first time that we landed people on the moon, it was like six landings, each with like two white men. So one of the big things this time is to actually land a woman on the moon. But they discovered water ice in some craters on the poles of the moon, which they think would be a big strategic resource. So that's kind of some of the drivers. But what do you think about returning to the moon and space exploration in general?
I think space exploration is a really interesting area. Unfortunately, it's also a very expensive area, so it is hard to finance, especially for the government to finance it. But I think there's a lot to be learned from space exploration, and I don't know, I feel like we haven't even tapped into the potential of it at this point. The most I've heard is, trying to find resources from other planets, which is an interesting proposition. I don't know. It sounds very far out there. It's hard to actually imagine that this is technology that is, within a few decades, potentially going to be more commonplace than it is now.
Well, I mean, you're a computer science student, and I've seen some of your videos where you look at kind of older machines and compare them to newer machines. If you look back, say, 60, 70 years ago, how expensive were computers?
You had to be some sort of institution, like a university or some government office, to be able to afford one. And now any person can own, up to a dozen of them easily. So I definitely think with computer technology getting cheaper, it lends itself to other types of technologies getting cheaper. So I would imagine space travel now is definitely more practical than it was back in 1969.
Well, I mean, so computer technology is one thing, but the connection is not as clear there. But consider the price of airline tickets. Coronavirus notwithstanding, I mean, if you look back like 60, 70 years ago, it was really a rich endeavor. And now we can hop on flights for like, 20, $30 to go between places.
Yeah, that's something I hadn't even considered, though. That is a good point there. Yeah, I think that is definitely, it makes sense to me. I suppose part of it has to do with the fact that, as there became more airlines and more equipment to do air travel like that is part of what made it cheaper. So I would imagine if there was more infrastructure for space exploration, you could see the same effect. Of course, I'd imagine it's still going to be a lot more technically complex than, air travel, just because there's more energy that needs to be expended in general with it. But I suppose, the expensive parts like constructing a rocket or something like that could be made cheaper with economies of scale.
Yeah, and one thing about rockets today is for the longest time we build a rocket, use it one time, and throw it away. And have you heard of a company called SpaceX?
I'm familiar with SpaceX. That's Elon Musk's company, right?
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're actually recovering the first stage, refurbishing it, and reusing it. And that's really drastically reduced the cost of them launching things. and they're working on this huge, completely reusable spacecraft called the Starship. They're actually building it in Brownsville, Texas, near Boca Chica. Actually, in Boca Chica, Texas, near Brownsville. And anyway, they're planning to build like 2 of these a week and actually have hundreds of them doing as much as 3 flights a day. That's sort of Elon's vision. So a completely different scale than what we've seen so far. He's like the Henry Ford of rocketry, I think. Did you know that Jeff Bezos had a space company?
I did. I don't remember the name of it off the top of my head.
Blue Origin.
I know there were 2 private space companies. What was that?
Blue Origin.
Oh, okay. That's it.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not as familiar with that company.
Assuming both of them are still, how should we say, solvent in a month or 2, which I give them good odds for. It could be kind of an exciting, assuming, we live in really strange times this week. So it'd be interesting to look at this video a year from now and go, So it's really expensive, and I've gotten some reactions about, from various people, like, we need to solve our problems here on Earth first. We shouldn't go out into space. We'll just mess it up. Things like that. I was wondering what your thoughts were.
Well, I definitely agree that, being that spaceflight is incredibly expensive, sometimes it can seem a bit wasteful. Though I feel like some of the information we've learned, at least from NASA, exploring other planets, is really insightful. I'm aware to some extent that a lot of knowledge regarding like advanced physics has been gotten from any sort of space exploration like that. And I'm also familiar with how much technology evolved from the space race in the 1960s, and I would imagine potentially if the conditions were able to be recreated today, we could see some major benefits in areas other than space exploration that would make the effort to do something like a moonshot project or something else, worth the investment. I will say the one thing I'm a little less aware of is, besides exploration, how useful traveling to space would be. But I suppose that's just because that is a very large-scale thing to do, and a lot of the scales of problems on Earth aren't quite the same scale as spaceflight being a viable solution, if that makes sense.
It does. Jeff Bezos, one of his visions that he talks about is the idea of moving like heavy industry and mining off of Earth into space to kind of protect the Earth. So that's kind of what he envisions at some point, which could be kind of good. Okay, so let's say that that traveling like into orbit became cheap and affordable as like an airline ticket. Is that something that, and safe too. Is that something that would interest you?
The major factor for me would be safety. But beyond that, I think it would be an interesting thing to at least experience once. Just because I'm sure to some extent it's something that very few people have experienced now, and just to, I don't know. I think back to, you mentioned the project to visit the moon again now, and it's still hard for me to conceptualize that, however many years ago it was, there were people on the moon in 1969 and into the early 70s. And it's something you say to yourself and it just doesn't seem to feel true. But I would imagine that if spaceflight was something that I could afford and it was safe to do, it would be an amazing opportunity that I would probably take it up.
And so just to explore the affordability and the safe side, like to go into orbit and come back to the Earth, like what would you consider to be affordable?
It's hard to say. I suppose it also depends on duration. That's a tough question.
How about for a week on like a space hotel orbiting the Earth?
For a week, I think the upper limit of what I would consider worth an investment would be maybe $5,000-$10,000. It would be definitely expensive. Like that is still not couch change by any means, but I think that would at least be the threshold where I would at least understand why a service like that could exist. And had I had the money to spend on it, I would at least consider possibly doing it.
And then on the safe side, one way to look at that is how many passengers have flown into space ahead of you without an incident? Like, what would your threshold be there? Like, would you need millions or hundreds of thousands or just tens?
Humans are very bad at measuring stuff like this. Like I believe air travel is safer than driving in a car, and yet most people are afraid of flying on a plane. So it's hard for me to say. I'd say probably a failure rate near air travel would probably be a threshold I could see. I don't know. I'd probably want it to at least be in the 0.01% failure rate or something like that, to feel comfortable myself with doing it.
0.01% failure rate. I guess also the other side of that is how many samples would you need? I guess to get to 0.01, you would need like 10,000, you think? 10,000 people flying?
I definitely wouldn't want to be in the first of, some small group. Now, what that number is, it's hard to say. Probably not below the first 100. I'll be a little more generous. But after 100 or so successful flights, I would probably feel a little more comfortable doing it.
That sounds good. Well, thank you so much, George. I really appreciate you helping me with this interview. I thought this would be a good project to help me get out and meet people, but that seems to, we got to do the opposite thing now. So.
Well, I'm glad to help.
Thanks.